Miami is a vulnerable city to climate change due to sea level rise, flooding, and various other climate-amplified disasters. This presentation by Critical Friends Group 4 will provide an adaptation and preparedness plan for managing these challenges. As with all complex systems, there are connections between these different ideas, and our team will be providing insights and recommendations based on resources provided throughout the MESH program so far. Together, these strategies will form an interconnected and proactive approach to strengthening Miami's resilience in the face of a changing climate. My name is Ellie Mott, and I will begin by exploring the changes to the infrastructure of the built environment in Miami, Florida. There is a challenging dynamic of needing to meet current needs but planning for future necessities, both of which are difficult to define and subject to change. This requires an interconnected, time-dependent, and sometimes ambiguous nature of approaching infrastructure design for the built environment. The first consideration is long-term planning and how even the short-term approaches can be building towards the long-term goal. The first way to do this is focusing on the most vulnerable communities, and this will be one of the biggest changes. Throughout history in the United States, better infrastructure and resources have favored the affluent areas of town. This must change if Miami wants to provide a safe space to live for all members of the community. Raising the bar on standard engineering practices would mean holding projects accountable to design standards that take into account the imminent impacts of climate change. Historically, the engineering industry has settled for the standard level of care that has worked in the past, but doesn't require sustainability and longer design lives to be seriously considered. Due to the unprecedented conditions of climate change, greater safety factors and longer design life is needed on all projects. Redundant systems provide more barriers and safety nets for failures in the system. For example, greater redundancy in combating storm drainage and sanitary sewer combination is a major threat to health, and more methods of addressing this issue needs to be a top priority. Due to the uncertainty of the magnitude and frequency of climate change and flooding, multiple processes to deal with these issues are needed. We often settle for finding one solution to the problem, but more layers of safeguards are going to be required. Solutions must adapt to the changing climate of the Earth, and these solutions need to be developed collaboratively. An adaptive approach requires understanding how water will move into communities and exploring effective ways to manage, convey, and accommodate it, depending on the location. Collaborating with all stakeholders will be challenging with people from diverse backgrounds, perspectives, and priorities. However, it's essential to addressing an issue of this scale and complexity. The strategies recommended for changing infrastructure also can apply in some ways to measures to reinforce buildings and homes. To give more tangible examples, we will now investigate a couple practical approaches to reinforcing structures. The simplest idea to address flooding for buildings would be to elevate them. However, this wouldn't work for all structure types, and not all communities could afford to have modifications done to their homes. Providing grants or loans to people that have historically struggled with flooding in their homes would be a great first step to knowing which homes will be most impacted by climate-amplified disasters. Site design on projects is an important part of providing the best drainage situation on site, as well as setting the finished floor elevation of new buildings. Having flood mitigation measures as a top priority would minimize the likelihood of impacts later down the road. Another aspect of prevention is deciding where development occurs, which ties into the zoning approach. It's important to consider where structures should be built and recognize that not all land near the coast should be developed. If the eventual result of sea level rise means people will lose their homes, a system needs to be in place to help them relocate in an equitable way. There are likely whole law classes that could discuss the complex nature of how this could work, but measures need to be taken to understand the best approach for when these issues arise. Being proactive for when disaster strikes is a vital component of creating a resilient community, and this will be further explored by Alyssa with our emergency evacuation plan.
Thank you, Ellie. My name is Alyssa Robertson, and I will discuss a proposed emergency evacuation plan for Miami. According to the City of Miami, the city is most vulnerable to flooding, extreme storms, and heat. As learned in Module 6.2, a disaster is not the event itself, but its impact on environments, property, and people. A strong evacuation plan can reduce this impact. One key measure is a designated emergency response team, possibly made up of trained citizen volunteers. These individuals could support vulnerable neighbors, reduce strain on professional responders, improve organization, and communicate with government officials. Clear protocols and communication are essential. Drills and alerts are vital for ensuring citizens are educated about what to do. The city should provide a radio station or phone number for updates. Since phone service may fail, at-risk individuals may need backup satellite phones. Communities should also have generators to power essential equipment, such as medical devices, during emergencies like heat waves. Neighborhoods should have designated emergency checkpoints with supplies like generators, satellite phones, first aid kits, water, food, and flashlights. Residents must know checkpoint locations before and during emergencies through clear auditory and visual signals. Another measure we propose is assigning emergency evacuation routes and clearly informing citizens of their designated routes. Because traffic patterns can be predicted, city officials can plan ahead and guide residents in ways that reduce congestion and prevent backups. It would also be beneficial to assign evacuation zones, allowing those most at risk to leave first, such as residents in low-lying areas prone to flooding and storm surge, as well as individuals with disabilities or other factors that may affect their ability to evacuate. Citizens should be encouraged to carpool and check whether their neighbors have transportation. In addition, buses should be available to assist those who do not have access to a car. Outside of Miami, facilities must be prepared to house evacuees, meet basic needs, and support their return home. Residents should know their assigned facility and how to reach it without relying on a map. Emergency evacuation is a community effort, making localized organization and preparedness essential. Dory will further discuss plans for adapting to risk in Miami.
Thanks, Alyssa. I will now discuss plans to adapt to risk given Miami's proximity to the coast and to the equator. It is the city especially at risk of dangers from the sea level rising and global warming. These environmental shifts will also create risks economically and socially if they continue to worsen. The first potential risk which I will discuss, which is already occurring, is the sea level rise and flooding. A managed retreat plan should be adopted to accommodate this, to relocate people who are displaced by these conditions. A nature-based solution to this risk could be floodable parks, which are waterfront parks which can store floodwater to decrease flow rates. An example of a floodable park is shown in the picture on the slide. Extreme heat is another likely risk. To plan for this, Miami needs additional cooling centers and a nature-based solution of urban forests to increase carbon sequestration and also create additional shade to cool down the urban area. Economic risks will occur with climate change, including devastation to infrastructure from flooding. This could be combated by creating a climate infrastructure fund, since insurance companies are leaving people vulnerable. Creating additional green infrastructure jobs of building nature-based solutions in the area would be another win-win solution. The final risk I will discuss is social inequality and climate gentrification, which will occur when people are displaced from their homes. There needs to be a plan in place to protect vulnerable populations by building affordable housing on higher land and also pursuing nature-based solutions in low-income neighborhoods like community gardens. Through adopting any or all of these plans, the impacts of climate change in Miami could be lessened and risks could be mitigated.
My name is Megan Reich, and I will be discussing public health measures to ensure physical and mental health in Miami in the face of climate change. As Ellie highlighted previously, one of the biggest issues Miami will face lies in their stormwater systems and drainage, with many consequences for human health. As sea levels rise and storms become more intense, Miami's drainage systems risk becoming increasingly overwhelmed. This can lead to flooding that contaminates water supplies, spreads pathogens, and increases the risk of illnesses like cholera. Public health measures must include pump systems, increased drainage capacity, and flood-resilient sanitation networks to prevent disease outbreaks. Miami must focus on flexible, adaptive systems that work with water rather than against it. Outside of infrastructure upgrades that include backup power, elevated equipment, and backup water supplies, there's also a need for disaster response teams that can ensure the distribution of clean water after storms. Another critical health issue that needs to be addressed is urban heating. Rising temperatures combined with dense development and limited green space create a dangerous urban heat island effect. This increases the risk of heat exhaustion and death and can worsen chronic illnesses. Miami needs to invest in expanding tree cover to increase evapotranspiration, create shaded public areas, and ensure access to cooling centers. The city is notoriously humid, so finding ways to reduce the urban heat island effect through increasing vegetation and green space will be important in protecting human health. At the same time, the mental health burden is growing. The anxiety, stress, and insecurity caused from the uncertainty of not knowing when natural disasters will hit next, or how hard, has implications on the mental health of Miami residents. Natural disasters are also traumatic, so public health responses need to focus on the aftermath of devastating events, such as hurricanes, that may include loss of life or homes. Other important public health measures should focus on accessible mental health services, long-term support systems, and action plans in the face of an extreme weather event to minimize the loss of life and trauma. Ultimately, protecting health in Miami requires an integrated approach that strengthens water and sewage infrastructure, redesigns the built environment, and supports mental health. As climate change continues to contribute to sea level rise, warming temperatures, and extreme weather events, Miami will become increasingly vulnerable to flooding, public health emergencies, and loss of land, property, and life. Our plan focuses on the areas within the built environment that we can change to build resilience, as well as steps to take in the event in the event of an emergency to minimize loss of life and property.